Good evening.
Yeah, probably.
Thanks for coming out tonight as the term has now wound up. We're really happy to have this colloquium on criticism tonight. It's something that Mohsen has been thinking about for a while, and there have been various student conferences. Florencia Rodriguez organized a conference last year. It's something that I think is very much in the school, the issue of criticism. And tonight we have four contemporary important critics to kind of lead us through or talk us through this. I'll start just by introducing the panel. And the format tonight will be each of the panelists. I'll begin, but each of us will have a kind of position statement just to get things kind of on the table. And then we will discuss at the table for a few minutes. And then I want to very quickly turn it to the audience because I know that some of you will be eager to join in the conversation. So I want to keep it very informal. I start with an introduction of Florencia Rodriguez because actually we don't have to introduce her. She's a friend of the school, was here last year and organized the conference, What Criticism, last year at the GSD. Florencia is an Argentinian architect, but also an author of many articles, a critic, and also a founder and editorial director of Plot. One of the main objectives of Plot is to integrate Latin American architecture with global debates and production, and to promote the active role of criticism and theory in the transformation of the built environment. So a very instrumentalized kind of criticism. I mentioned the What Criticism in the Harvard lecture series, and she organized several others at the Torcuato di Tella School of Architecture, where she teaches. Oliver Wainwright, next to Florencia, is the architecture and design critic of The Guardian. He trained as an architect at Cambridge and the Royal College, worked at some architecture firms in London and some firm in Rotterdam, and has, again, written widely in various publications, from building design to Architects Journal to Domus. Christopher Hawthorne is the critic for the Los Angeles Times. He's been there since 2004. He's also a professor of practice at Occidental. Before coming to the Times, he was architecture critic for Slate. His writings have appeared in New York Times, The New Yorker. He grew up in Berkeley, but had the good sense to come to school on the East Coast, but went to the wrong East Coast school, Yale, where he studied. Sorry, I don't. There's something when you become associate dean. This gene goes off, and you start saying stuff like that. And last but not least, Michael Sorkin on what he thinks is the extreme left. But I must remind him, this is only the illusion of left. This is the real left. Right?
We shall see.
Michael likes to be introduced of what he is doing and intends to do. He is president and founder of Terraform, which is dedicated to research into different forms and practices of sustainable urbanism. He's president of the Forum and Institute of Urban Design, and distinguished professor of architecture at the graduate school at City College. But the reason sorry, and critic for The Nation. And he teaches at the GSD. But in a way, one has to mention that for 10 years he was critic at the Village Voice, which is an amazing career, and then at Architecture Record. And there are something like 20 books of criticism, but the one that at least our generation remembers is Exquisite Corpse, which of course collected those early pieces of criticism. So thank you all for joining us. Let me just start with my own kind of observation. This is going to be really short. of the architecture criticism that I've read, and I guess this might also be a slight, j'accuse a little bit for the panel. The idea of practice in various forms runs through contemporary architectural criticism. Not that most critics don't recognize or wouldn't recognize that, of course, practice is an imaginary symbolic construction, that being in the world, that our representations of the world are constructions. I know that everyone would recognize that, but typically the set of sort of structuring concepts or structuring dispositions, more I would say, typically takes up the idea of the practical, the context, the intentions, the constraints. All these sort of constituent ideas are constituted and always oriented toward the practical, the functions, and the consequences. Now, so the first context, one of the frames of this discussion, could be the difference between that kind of very immediate, local, sort of practical criticism and the kind of critical thought in the academy where things typically are the other way around. In the academy, we start with larger bodies of knowledge, styles, typologies, grammars, epistemes, diagrams, and typically see those systems as generating practice rather than the other way around. So typically, at least in history, these larger systems are seen to generate practice rather than practice being the controlling force. As a result, however, historians spend much more time constructing these large-scale past systems, the Baroque, the modern movement, and talking less about prognosis for future possibilities. So this is also a kind of difference, I think, in historiography and the academy and criticism. I want to come back to the point that criticism, to me, has become more and more local, more contextual, more immediate, but also less theoretical. And as a result, this is just reading recently, trying to figure out, are there patterns? I do think there are three that may be reducible to two sort of dogmas of a lot of contemporary criticism. First is that you have to honor what sociologists call the actors' categories. In other words, it's the audience, it's the actors, we call them users. It's their categories, their frames of reference that in criticism have to be primarily honored. That is to say, the discipline itself or history cannot be given priority over the categories of the users or the actors. As a result, the truth of criticism, if there is a truth, can only be social acceptance. A building is good if it's socially accepted. If it's not socially accepted, it's not. There's a recent debate between Aaron Betsky and the New York Times article on exactly this, that they asked someone's mother, and she didn't like the building, so therefore the building couldn't possibly be likable. This is what I mean by actors' categories. And then finally, kind of relativism, that even though it's only the user's system of beliefs that are relevant, you can't privilege one system of belief over any other. There's a kind of radical relativism. And I think this comes from a kind of lack of certainty or maybe lack of conviction about, that we can establish and evaluate. So I want to suggest that against this, that the most interesting uses of criticism will be those in which have a mediating component and then can link a particular case, a particular context, a particular local situation to some wider domain, whether that's defined in terms of disciplinary ideas or a larger history of architecture and the environment and the city. That would be one kind of frame. I'm going to now turn to the illusion of the left and ask Michael if he will start the panel in a sort of set of position statements or comments or frames. Thanks.
The illusion of a position.
Yeah, right.
So I did get the word that we were meant to say 5 minutes worth this morning, and I took these notes on JetBlue, and it was a very short flight, so short that no coffee was served. And I have therefore forgotten the rubric under which I made this list of 10 vital statements. It could be what we do or should as critics. I think to begin that many of us, I speak for the panel, are drawn to criticism of architecture because architecture is so lucid. It is uniquely legible in terms of its reproduction and representation of the quality of relations, of social relations, and therefore intriguing, worth unpacking, revelatory, something that exposes truths about social relations and not simply about formal or tectonic relations. I think that the task of the critic is therefore to make legible, in the first instance, the character of the scene between culture in general and the set of disciplines that comprise architecture and design. That's what we were supposed to do, right? Is speak to the polyphony of disciplines at the GSD. Therefore, it is relevant for critics to dilate, via the medium of the discussion of architecture, about the income gap, the fate of the earth, urbanization and its discontents, and more generally, to use an unfortunate word, about the nature of lifestyle and its accessibility and availability. I think that's why I practice criticism, is that it is effectively, for me, a way of talking about the social universe and about the world of politics. Yeah. So we perform this kind of analysis, this bridge building, and I think I'm talking about a different kind of bridge than Michael was talking about, obviously on the basis of principles. And if I could set out the principles for my critical practice, they are the defense, in no particular order, of equity, of beauty, and of sustainability. We're always coming up with these triads in terms of critical categories. But in terms of having criteria to use in vetting the nature of the discursive bridge between what's happening in society and what's happening in building, I think we're obliged to bring something to the table. So for me, criticism is not simply an aesthetic matter, but it is radically political. We're obliged as well, I think, as part of our charge, to define terms. So this includes as part of the critical task, the investigation and mediation of a whole series of discourses that you referred to in terms of this somewhat deductive pose of the academy. Nevertheless, we are confronted with a welter of contesting discourses, and we're obliged to sort them out, to unpack their arcana, and to mediate the conflicts and disparities that come from having a variety of languages and arguments at our disposal. This ranges from questions of parametrics to questions of preservation. We certainly have an obligation to what was your word? To the actors to suss out and evaluate this set of categories and perform numerous acts of translation. So that's part of the remit. This obligation, I think, also includes interrogating and adjudicating the boundaries of the discipline, which are very fluid indeed, especially nowadays. If one were to observe something about the academy, it is the seeming insecurity of the disciplinary boundaries. I mean, at this school, we have seen production about landscape urbanism, ecological urbanism. I apparently teach urban designers and urban planners. There's infrastructural urbanism, agricultural urbanism. There is I think an obligation not simply to try to discern the nature of the differences among these categories, but to observe them in a kind of meta-discursive way, to interrogate why this kind of wanton plurality of discourses and disciplines are jostling for control of the academy and of the conversation. You know, I'm a professor of urban design, which is a rankly phony discipline by anybody's lights, and we are, you know, in an age where a kind of succession of fonus balonus disciplines are struggling to become the hegemon of the built environment, and in particular the urban. So not so interesting, particularly in the academic field, that there should be such contestation, but very interesting that there should be such a proliferation, you know, such a kind of spinelessly plural invention just at this moment in time, something that critics have to unpack. I think that it is the job of critics equally to produce a demystified and accessible form of connoisseurship. I just finished reading a book that a friend of mine wrote about Oscar Wilde's tour of the United States. He was here for a full year, I think 1876 was the year, gave 5 or 6 lectures a week, even in coal mines, you know, all over the United States. Biloxi, he had lunch with Jefferson Davis, and he lectured about interior decoration. I find this fantastical. You know, there's another story about the way in which he was, you know, Kim Kardashian avant la lettre, you know, who invented the idea of being famous simply for being famous, who in fact, you know, propelled his literary career by entering the lists as a writer already a celebrity. This is very interesting to me. But I am so curious. I mean, what this book lacks is a recording of what he actually said. And the idea that he is in, you know, Reno, Nevada, lecturing about interior decoration, Oscar Wilde no less, to a bunch of yobs, absolutely, you know, is a touchstone for some form of critical practice. You know, we'll unpack this later. I think we need to admit, as critics, that you know, a primary function that we fulfill is as propagandists. And by propaganda, I understand reason supplemented somehow by passion, a clear position, advocacy. You know, I think we can do not much better than to make propaganda for those 3 categories that I described. We are also obliged, I think, you know, particularly as we are assailed, to fight for criticism's relevance and for its remit. So we are constantly obliged, given the fact that, you know, Ruskin is long gone. There is no kind of single, unified, commanding discourse of the critical. We need every day to establish our relevance via whatever technique. And in light of this vast plurality of discourses of the environment, to secure our remit, broadly, I hope. I think we are also responsible. Nobody has their digital, no, oh, she's tweeting. I think that we are also obliged in the age of the twit, or the tweet, whatever it's called, to defend both the project and the capacity of prose. In an era of contracted attention spans, I know that everybody at this stage regrets the dissipation of the long form of critical writing. So the struggle for another 2 words from that fucking editor is something that is consequential and important and part of what we do. I think we are also obliged, and now forgive me for being a little bit global, to curb the human intrusion on the planet, which is to say, we no longer are permitted to speak about nature, since we know that it is a conjury, an invention of ourselves, you know, that devised sometime in the 18th century. But I think it is desperately important that we keep the debate on the nature of nature, the extent of nature, and our relationship to it very much alive. And finally, I believe that it is our incontrovertible task to fight for kindness, for generosity, for excellence, and for the good. Oh, finished. Thank you. Polite applause.
Well, that's nice to know I'm not the only one thinking on obligations and responsibilities. I have some images here that are not exactly about architecture. So first, hello and thank you for the invitation and for the introduction. As Michael said before, last year as a Loeb Fellow, I organized this symposium called What Criticism? And I'm an editor and a writer myself, so I like thinking about my work permanently and trying to produce exactly, to understand the significance of what I'm producing. In that occasion, together with a very interesting group of people, some of them around here today, we analyzed how the contemporary modes of communication that seem dispersed and dissolved today in the new media are not all equivalent to the annulment of new possibilities for the written word and for discourse and critical thinking in general. On the contrary, and that's my point of view, they suggest a wider reach, this idea of the spilling, of a dissemination, of a distribution. I like the image of a cultural sprawl in a way. They imply new ways of thinking about territory, ideas, discourse, transculturation, absorption, among other things. Even though new media potentiates immensely this way of expanding that I'm mentioning and territorial networks, before the digital, I think that this aim to communicate is something that was already defining our not anymore modern way to live or to inhabit our world. We can analyze ads and propaganda that we're talking about and understand the possibility also of images to be a vehicle of some ideologies and ideas, and hence go or try to participate in social transformation, and I think that's kind of important. Let's think, for example, on TV and this idea of the live worldwide transmission, starting with the moon landing, for instance, and what does that mean for the rest of the world. Let's think about how political or social intelligence work to disseminate ways of understanding or to breed some ideas. Or let's remember, for instance, the Tupperware or the Avon experiences as territorial lessons now, in a way. So that's why I choose some images just to orient this idea of the word as a possibility to generate territories and to make place with discourse and written word. And these are just simple images of how the telephone companies in the 50s or the post-war, more particularly, tried to communicate. I see the low res in this size is terrible, but we can imagine this idea of this territory organized by communication and this not so secret weapon. It's just to understand this possibility of the word as a vehicle, the nation call. Or this other idea when Zé Carioca, that is the Brazilian character of Disney, was created among with other actions that were generated during the Good Neighbor policy, or when Rockefeller was part of the, I want to read the name of the Office of the Coordinator of Inter-American Affairs. No? At this moment, Zé Carioca was created. The first exhibition of Latin American architecture was done at the MoMA, and there was then a cultural movement to be able to generate Latin American manner or Latin American identity, for instance. This is very well understood and explained in Patricio Del Real dissertation that was called, I want to quote it correctly, Building a Continent, the Idea of Latin American Architecture in the Early Post-War. So this use of images, and the possibility to, as I was saying, in Tupperware, for instance, to say, well, with this thing that is going to take place in the domestic space and these conversations, you will be able to disseminate and to generate a network of conversation, a network of, in this this time a marketing network, but it's not that. Andres Jaque, for instance, makes a very nice research on this, and there was this experience that he made with some rings that were called gardens, skin garden, and every time you bought one of these rings, you had to kind of sign a contract, and if you wore this ring that was made with trash, in a way, you did have to start a conversation with somebody else about sustainability and where that trash came from and what can be done and what is the relationship between the environment and your skin, because there was something very close to your skin. At the same time, you did have to send a postcard to his office, that is called the Office of Political Innovation. He's an architect, but he thinks about territory in these ways. Just talking about how that conversation was gone and try to organize some new experimental protocol that I don't know how it did went. And I'm not sure if the protocol was successful, but this idea of a thing and a conversation that goes to a place and another and can be reproduced, but at the same time is different each time it takes place, is something that is interesting for me. This is just how the rings looked alike. And just to show something about architecture, I think the history of architecture is full of these ideas of how critical thinking or ideological constitution or the images were spreading certain new ways of living. This idea of the lifestyle of modern architecture, Schulman participated as a photographer, and if we want to think something similar to that, if we think of our contemporary photographer, Iwan Banda, that was here last year also talking, he has had a huge impact in the media, and how we editors now want to show architecture and choose an, I don't know, approach to the images and objects without so many filters. So let's see, this is just Schulman there. And this is Montadas, Anthony Montadas, just to leave it there. So I believe that in the last decades, this polarized capitalism has turned criticism into kind of a Gordian knot and silenced knot that need to be untied in a way or expanded. So in one hand, an extreme pragmatism and the financial bubble we all have seen illustrated in pages on websites have led to spectacular forms with sometimes no meanings. I'm not against that, so I just want to be able to judge every time. And in other parts of the world, especially for instance in Latin America, where I work day by day, some emergencies or the lack of resources has also blinded critical opportunities to move beyond and to be able to ask the project or ask architecture other things. So with all of this, I want to affirm that criticism and discourse should embrace their impossible relationship with their object to push for changes. For that, critical thinking has to clear out its responsibilities / desires, I think, and understand itself as expansionist and not conclusive as an activity and a way of working. It has to be useful. That is something I always write about, to add significance, to interpret, to denounce, to translate. And it should conform fields and intellectual territories, as I was trying to illustrate here. But something important is that it should be at least a little bit uncomfortable, and I always think about this. It should be uncomfortable, not just or not necessarily for the reader, but for the one who is practicing criticism, for ourselves. I believe that what we do should dream to transcend our own activities, and that we have the necessity or the obligation to play the role of the other, of otherness, and to be a little bit throwing some light to the current of times, to quote Tafuri in a way. So that's it.
Thank you. Oliver.
Well, I'm going to begin by practicing,
Thank you.
criticism as a form of spatial practice and invite people to come and occupy all of the empty seats in the middle of the room. People that are otherwise sitting on the floor or leaning against walls, please do come and have a seat. So yeah, criticism can be a form of practice, as I might be able to demonstrate, but no, maybe not. Okay, well, I'm quite interested to be invited to talk about the crisis, the so-called crisis in architectural criticism, because it's the sixth time in 2 years that I've had to either write or talk about this topic. And every time I get that email, it makes me slightly alarmed that I might be doing my job wrong. Architecture criticism in crisis, the forthcoming challenge of writing about the modern world. But it's a phenomenon that's been going on again and again and again throughout architectural history. And just wanted to start with a couple of quotes that could come from any time. Other arts are subject to the frankest criticism, but the art of architecture has so far been, to a great extent, immune. Another quote. The 25 journals recording contemporary building and providing material for architectural history are completely uncritical. Buildings, good, bad, and indifferent, are presented without any attempt at criticism. The first one of those quotes comes from the first issue of Architectural Design, 1930. The second one is Hugh Casson giving a lecture at the AA in 1948. So it seems that architects just aren't satisfied unless there's a crisis in architectural criticism going on. And I, every time, would rebut the notion that there is ever a crisis in architectural criticism. And my kind of position for this evening is that it's in rude health. It's as healthy as it's ever been. And the kind of volume and quantity of criticism is something to be celebrated. So that's point number one. The dearth of criticism in the UK, at least, is a recurring theme often brought out by the kind of older generation of critics. And the thing that they always point towards as the main evil is the internet. And not only the internet, but the kind of slew of unmediated information on the internet. So things like Dezeen, ArcDaily, Design Boom, this kind of incontinent splurge of stuff, which is seen, inherently as a kind of pernicious force. And a kind of rival to the good old long-form criticism. I would say that's incredibly insulting to the reader and kind of suggests that you're incapable of differentiating a press release from a 2,000-word critique of a piece of architecture. So, to be honest, I think that kind of stuff only adds to the melee of media. Dezeen is not something to be scared of. It's not taking away from the traditional critic's role. It's providing a kind of raw splurge of, visual sewage for you guys to sift through, pick out the good bits, and then form your own kind of criticism. And I think the internet has actually had the effect of kind of democratizing the process of becoming a critic. I can't actually say it was my route into the job, but there are 2-3 prominent critics in the UK who began just by doing their own blog and got picked up by editors. Owen Hatherley was one who went on these amazing kind of drifts around the new ruins of Great Britain, touring all of our failed attempts at post-industrial regeneration, doing 5,000-word rants on the internet that became kind of viral. And he's worked his way up, was picked up by Building Design magazine, now writes for The Guardian with me, and has become a critic just by doing this kind of self-propelled anger, I suppose, on a blog. So the internet, has democratized and hasn't necessarily undermined criticism. For my own role, it's revolutionized it. I mean, The Guardian hadn't hired a critic in 15 years when this job advert cropped up. And again, it was a slightly terrifying job advert. It said this person will reinvent architectural criticism for the 21st century. Almost as daunting as the topic that we're tackling tonight. But it's because The Guardian's gone from a circulation of 190,000 printed paper to, I think, 110 million unique views. So as a platform, the internet is, helping us disseminate and critique a much broader world. The Guardian's, as a specific case, I think the Snowden files and the whole WikiLeaks thing was a fascinating point where we shifted from becoming this relatively provincial thing to something which means that the architecture critic gets invited to Harvard, of all places, to talk about criticism. So it's kind of fascinating for me just in 2 years seeing this kind of force mushroom. Nothing to do with me, I hasten to add. But I wonder, actually, if the so-called crisis of architectural criticism is actually a crisis of architecture itself. And that the architects and the whole kind of process and profession of architecture is becoming so atomized and so disaggregated, and I say we because I kind of was/an architect, are losing our authority, and we're incredibly paranoid about our discipline. I don't know how it works over here so much, but in the UK, the design and build contract means the architect is kind of at the bottom of the food chain rather than the top. We're no longer the grand master at the top of the pyramid, and it's easier to blame the critics, isn't it, really, rather than just blame our own profession. Maybe the crisis isn't in architectural criticism, maybe the crisis is in architecture itself. So I'm going to keep that very brief. That's my little platform, and look forward to the rest of the debate.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, Oliver. I agree with much of what you just said, and thanks to the GSD for having me. I don't know that I agree, Michael, with any part of your introduction. I think you've described a kind of crowdsourced or a kind of focus group criticism, which I think is a kind of hack criticism, and I don't think any of us practices it. I don't think any of us in this room is interested in reading that, but that kind of approach. But I think all I can do is just explain my own background and how I've tried to shape my own criticism. Let me also say that Michael Sorkin's comment about the legibility of buildings is something that I quite agree with, and that's what I continue to find so remarkable about buildings, is the degree to which they express the kind of political compromise that produces them. I was just yesterday down at Ground Zero to have a tour of One World Trade Center, which is a project I've been writing about for many, many years, and it is, in its awfulness, a sort of perfect expression of the kind of political compromise that has gone into at various stages. First as a Libeskind project, then as a Libeskind David Childs project, then as a David Childs Durst project, and now apparently as just a Durst project. The architects' names have been stripped entirely now from all of the promotional materials, but as an object in the skyline is almost a perfect representation of that process, that terrible process that's produced it. So I think that kind of legibility and explaining it, reading it for readers is at the center of what we do as critics. Michael mentioned that I started at the LA Times in 2004, which means I just passed the 10-year mark last fall. And I want to just talk by way of introduction about that decade and the kind of shifts that have happened at the LA Times, in Los Angeles, and in architectural criticism. Each one of those has gone through a sort of crisis of faith, even a kind of existential crisis in its own way, and that each of those three has really shaped my approach to criticism and how it's changed over that decade. So when I was hired in 2004, the LA Times was arguably the finest newspaper in the country. I think we had the finest Iraq coverage, we had the finest Washington bureau, we had the strongest roster of critics. We won 5 Pulitzer Prizes that year. Our editors, the ones who hired me, were John Carroll and Dean Baquet, who now runs the New York Times, of course. There was a remarkable kind of ambition at the paper in all levels, from international to local coverage, and of course, that has changed in a lot of ways. We had at that point just about as many editorial employees as the New York Times. I think we had almost 1,200, and they had maybe 1,250 or 1,300. Now, 10 years later, we have less than half that. We have about 500 editorial employees. And the New York Times, even after its latest round of buyouts, is still well over 1,000. So their numbers have dipped, but only slightly. So that has meant a wholesale series of discussions that parallel the ones in criticism, actually, about what kind of paper the LA Times wants to be, and a focus on local coverage. We've lost a lot of talent, of course. You can't have your editorial staff without watching a lot of skill go out the door. And I've gone through 5 or 6 editors-in-chief and as many publishers. And the company as a whole, the Tribune Company, which also owns the Chicago Tribune, has gone through a protracted bankruptcy process. But there is actually a very interesting kind of momentum at the paper now. We have a new publisher and some new digital initiatives, which I think might lend themselves quite well to some kind of new experiments in criticism. So that's been one shift. The other is in the city of Los Angeles itself, which is going through a really profound change as it tries to move past its dependence on the car and the kind of radically privatized nature of its 20th century post-war self and establish at least a semi-coherent kind of post-suburban identity. It's a city that's trying to reanimate its public sphere. It's a city that's building quite ambitiously a public transit system. It's a city that no longer produces either single-family houses or freeways, which were the basic building blocks of that post-war privatized city. So it's a city that is really asking itself what kind of place it wants to be. It's really facing a lot of very basic questions about its future, and that makes it a fantastic subject for an architecture critic, and that has become, in fact, my chief subject, writing about this city. So that means not just writing about buildings, although I certainly do that. It means writing about the boulevards. I did a whole series of pieces on the boulevards of LA a couple of years ago as they began, as I saw it, to reemerge from the substantial shadow of the freeway system. And in fact, the idea of the freeway and kind of frictionless driving across the Southern California region became so attractive that we even remade our boulevards in the post-war years to try to make them into miniature freeways. And over the last decade or so, or the time that I've been in LA, we have begun to try to reverse that and make the boulevards, really reconceptualize the boulevards as public space, is actually a fantastic reservoir of public space in a city that has been stereotyped for not having any, or having open and public space only at the periphery, at the beach and in the mountains. And there is a sense now that the boulevards, the streets of the city, in fact, can be places where the full range of urban life has a chance to play out, rather than being a kind of monoculture the way a freeway is. And it means writing about immigration. I spent last year working on a series of stories on the relationship between immigration and architecture in Los Angeles, which was really a series of stories about post-immigrant LA. Immigration peaked in LA County in about 1990. So we've really become a city which is now, and a region which is now 50% or more Latino, right around 50%. But it's really a city of second generation or settled immigrants. 5% of the children in LA County are immigrants themselves, but 60% of the kids in LA County have at least one parent who's an immigrant. And that gives you a sense of the really dramatic shift that's happened demographically. So I wrote 3 pieces at the end of last year trying to explore what that shift demographically meant, how it was playing out architecturally and in terms of the urban spaces of the city. So I continue to travel. I continue to write about places like One World Trade, but the real focus of my work has been this change in the kind of civic character of Los Angeles. And in fact, I'm starting a project at Occidental College where I've been teaching for several years called the Third Los Angeles Project, which will be a series of conversations on this contemporary LA over the course of the next 3 or 4 months. And very briefly, the third LA means that we are moving away from that post-war LA, but actually there's a kind of very extensive first Los Angeles before World War II that we tend to forget about. And in fact, all the things that LA is now struggling to add and became infamous, especially places like the East Coast for not having, that is, for lacking places to walk, great civic architecture, multifamily, innovative multifamily architecture, forward-looking urban planning. We actually produced all of those things in really remarkable quantities in the first half of the 20th century, or to go back a little bit further, between 1880 or so when modern LA was founded and World War II. So you saw one of the slides earlier of the Julius Schulman shot of the Pierre Koenig case study house. So to give you a sense, if you can imagine that image on the left and a different image on the right will suggest to you the way that I think LA has really changed. So if you imagine that Schulman photo that you can all picture in your mind's eye, that's a kind of classic second LA, kind of post-war privatized space. An idea of lifestyle, to go back to that word, that's detached from the public realm, that attains its glamour actually precisely from the separation it produces from the public realm. And then on the right, imagine the immigration marches that took place in LA in 2006, where several 100,000 immigration rights protesters filled both Wilshire Boulevard, the real birthplace of car culture in LA, and also downtown, where they produced at the foot of City Hall one of the most remarkable images produced in LA in the last several decades. A couple 100,000 protesters at the foot of City Hall, a building that doesn't have a traditional plaza to receive them, but kind of announcing their presence in the city. So that shift from the kind of Schulman privatized LA to a populace that's interested in using that city in a much different way is really the focus of what I write about. And then finally, there's been in that decade, there's been a real shift in how we talk about and think about architecture criticism. There has been, as Ollie suggested, a whole series of very urgent symposia and publications about the crisis in criticism. And I agree with Ollie that it's been terrifically overblown. I think certainly for readers, this is a golden age of criticism. There are more places to read criticism than ever. If there's a crisis, it's in the kind of business model for publications, how you make money in this digital world. And to that extent, that's the same crisis that almost every creative field in the country is going through. It's the same crisis that struck Hollywood and the recording industry, how you navigate this shift to a digital production model and how you make money doing that. But I think there has been, within even newspaper criticism itself, a remarkable shift, a new focus on urbanism. Just the shift from Nikolai Urasov to Michael Kimmelman at the New York Times, whatever you make of the merits of each of those critics as writers, has been suggestive of a real change. I think that change was overdue in many ways. I also think that the pendulum has begun to swing a little bit far. I find myself missing reviews of individual buildings to go along with criticism about cities and the kind of things that I just described writing myself about LA. So a lot of people have used Ada Louise Huxtable as the kind of patron saint of a kind of criticism that's really tough-minded, interested in talking about real estate and politics in the city. I think what we forget, and what you'll realize if you go back and look at her reviews in any detail, is that she also wrote lots of really persuasive and powerful pieces about individual buildings or the work of an individual firm, and really talked about architecture per se at the level of the building. And I'm interested in reading more of those pieces and writing more of them as well.
Thank you. Well, thank you all. This is a very good start. I want to come to Michael's image of Oscar Wilde discoursing with the Yobs, and ask each of you to comment on two issues together. One, the issue of audience, and I'm thinking it's helpful for me in sort of thinking about this panel discussion. It was helpful for me to compare the work we do in a school where the audience is not only spatially fixed and confined and captured, but is also committed, and there's a certain uniformity, at least in everyone studying, architecture, one of the design disciplines, and the very difference between that audience and that venue, and Oscar Wilde with the Yobs, or a venue that is online, but especially when you write, are you writing for? Or do you thinking a very general audience, or are you thinking about architects and designers? I mean, all of you were very insistent about sort of trying to write change, and I'm wondering is it possible to write for change to architects and the profession, or do you write for change to a more general lay audience and hope for a change to come sort of from bottom up, and then the venue for that kind for either? So audience and venue together. In an expansive way, or also just in a kind of anecdotal way of how do you imagine your audience in order to affect change? How do you imagine that change will take place through writing? I mean, Michael, I'm thinking about. I do want to keep the Village Voice moment alive in the conversation, because it was one of those classic. It was one of the classic moments, and becomes a kind of benchmark where you really did make a difference. And I'm wondering if that is a kind of benchmark, and then come to Oliver and Christopher's comments about the positive role of media and the expansion. Sort of try to calibrate that in a way.
I mean, this is not a callous remark, but I'm somebody who never much thought about my audience. Mm-hmm. Indeed, when I used to write for The Voice, I would occasionally come upon somebody reading my column in the subway, and it would fill me with such anxiety I would have to go to the next car. I don't. Again, I'm not dissembling here, but I don't think about the audience. My assumption is, I do probably the majority of my writing in professional magazines. My assumption is that if I write for The Nation or The Voice, people have relatively developed political sense. If I'm writing for the professional magazines, I assume they have a relatively developed sense of architecture and architectural history. But I think one's obligation is simply to be succinct. Beyond this, somehow figuring an audience seems like a betrayal. Of one's responsibilities.
I don't understand that.
I think it can be dangerous too to think too much about your audience, but the audience has shifted dramatically. I think the way that it's changed is that critics can no longer assume an audience. We have a much bigger potential reach, but we don't have subscribers who are going down to the end of the driveway to pick up a newspaper and who will be at least seeing our byline as a matter of course. And I think that's been a tremendously productive thing actually for criticism, because we all have to prove ourselves in a different way because our hold on the audience is much more tenuous. But I think you, at the very base, you just have to think of yourself as the audience and produce the pieces that you would like to be reading. I mean, I think that's the only thing you can really rely on.
Can I just say exactly the opposite? That I think about your audience is key. And to me, most architectural writing suffers from being this kind of cotton wool syndrome, that it's a buffer to protect architectural culture from reality. So it's this incredibly kind of self-serving, inward-looking, myopic way of bolstering, architectural culture with a capital A. I think it's the role of the critic to kind of just crash reality straight into that, buffer zone of cotton wool and actually bring all of the kind of real dirty forces of kind of social and political things that are driving urban development and crash it into the kind of posturing of architectural theorizing. And I think
I agree entirely with that. I just think you can't pretend that you have an ideal reader. But in terms of expanding the audience, in terms of the subject matter, how you write, I entirely agree.
I was forced to think of it just because I made quite a dramatic shift from a very specialist publication that was this weekly architectural journal that was kind of sent to every registered architect to this thing where my audience was literally anyone in the world. And the kind of shocking reality was I used the term colonnade of steel columns, which I thought was fairly straightforward. It got changed to a line of shiny metal poles. And I was furious. I phoned up my editor being, what are you doing to my text? So, that's the kind of thing you have to deal with occasionally.
Yeah. But staying with this just for a second and thinking about, Oliver, you're known as a tweeter a lot. And I'm wondering how, and I'm thinking of Florencia's, this ring, this fascinating ring that initiates conversation. Is tweeting, do you feel the feedback and the kind of dialogue that the rings were supposed to initiate? Is there actually a feedback possible now in a way that a classroom provides that, or certain other practices?
Yeah. I think my practice is very different in a way because the scenario in Argentina is different. There is not such a thing of newspaper criticism as common as an activity as it is here. And when we started the generation of a publication, you have to think about the audience and you really have to deal with lots of ideas of who is going to read the audience, who are you talking to, what do you want to achieve with the publication. Not only, of course, you want to sell it and to be able to make a living, but also you really want to generate something. That's why probably I have this obsession or idea of the need to make territory, because I really thought of the magazine, of the journal, as a way to generate a disciplinary network and to post certain things to generate conversation. So I'm not very much into tweeting. I use Facebook a lot more because it's more usual in Argentina to do that. But I think you do have this, I don't know, you really want to find something unexpected there also. And to find something that you are not exactly waiting for.
I just wanted to say I find Twitter actually kind of essential for my job, because so much of the kind of breaking news stuff and the slightly weird things that you might not spot looking at the mainstream websites crop up on Twitter, and you know, things that just happen instantly. I don't know if it made it down to the States, but there was a promotional video for an incredibly obnoxious apartment tower in London that was kind of its main selling point was there's no social housing in this block, and they'd made this kind of American Psycho style little movie to go along with it. And within about half an hour of it being launched, someone on Twitter had done a kind of mashup of the movie with American Psycho and done a whole new voiceover. And I found that and turned it into an article. And you know, sometimes you have to be writing, and at that speed, you know, something happens, and 20 minutes later it has to be published.
Well, no, this issue of pace, again, coming back to the pace of a classroom where, you know, you have a field trip, and then at the end of the semester you're expected to produce a paper, as distinct from you have a field trip and you have to have the paper in that same night. To talk a little bit about, and maybe if we could pair that, I love Michael's comment about the importance of keeping a certain vigilance about the prose. I mean, but some of this writing has to be done very fast. Stylistic considerations. How can you possibly consider a voice or an attitude or a mood at the same time you're writing with this kind of speed? I
think it's super helpful, at least for me, to work on all these levels, or as many of them as I can. So work on series that take an entire year to put together and are made up of several essays, and also Twitter, which I find incredibly useful for many of the same reasons. And I think it's a way to test your prose. I think if you can try to get the test for criticism is to explain a complex idea in direct language, clear language, and Twitter is a really useful sort of test for that. It also is a kind of note-taking device for me when I'm visiting buildings, but most important of all is just to follow other people. That if you follow the right people, someone described Twitter to me as Facebook is people you went to high school with, and Twitter is sort of people you wish you'd gone to high school with. If you follow the right people, and I think it is useful that way. But I think there's obviously a role at the other end too, and I think to the extent that we can all convince our editors to do longer pieces, and long, you know, in a newspaper these days is, you know, 1,500 words is very long for a daily newspaper, so it's all relative, of course, and I acknowledge that, but I think you have to try to work at the opposite ends of the spectrum, and I think there are still opportunities to do that even as the news hole shrinks. And again, the internet, you know, even though the stereotype is that it produces a kind of glibness or dumbs down the culture, it at the same time can be a repository for really long pieces where they're not the kinds of constraints on print and place in the you know, physical inches in the newspaper, which is how everything is measured in the print world.
I didn't realize that the subject was the crisis in criticism. Is it? I don't know that there's a crisis in criticism. There's certainly a crisis in editing. And you know, this is one of the skills that one acquires writing regularly, is the capacity to self-edit. I would say, reverting to another question, is that you know, I don't think about the audience particularly, but I do think about voicing and register to a certain degree, and you know, for me, it's a kind of sliding scale between the more or less hyperbolic. Since you know, increasingly I see my primary task as being an irritant. And have for a long time, and I mean irritant in the positive sense, in the grain of sand and the oyster sense, and sometimes the hyperbolic is the necessary register to actually have an irritating effect. So you know, this is how I, you know, a little bad language, you know, some slightly showier prose, not because I'm thinking about an audience, but because I'm thinking about an effect.
Yeah. So speaking of audience, we should turn the discussion and try to involve the audience. I know one of the things that you guys may or may know, of course, Florencia does know about the school. There are some people actually here. We have a post-professional degree programs who actually try to begin to think about people who will write for a living, not in the classroom so much, but through criticism and more of a different kind of writing. we have bloggers here, we have some various levels of publishing here, and maybe we could hear from some of you.
Hey everybody. So Michael, I'm partly an architect, partly a journalist. My name is Norman Vera. I used to be the architectural critic of Haaretz newspaper in Tel Aviv, and I contribute to Art in America Today, but also practice architecture. And my question is, do you think that critics are basically deprived architects? Some of you were architects in your former life, and I'm wondering, how do you try to bridge this gap? Michael?
I'm still an architect, and my office has never been busier. The sorry consequence for me is that, having alienated every architect and patron in New York, all my work is in China. So I disagree. I mean, I've always thought that the training as an architect gives you both knowledge and credibility. I see the projects as simply different registers of the same expression. So I would not feel authentic as a critic without, or as a design professor, without actually walking the walk. So.
Sorry, I think that leads to a question of what is architecture, because there are many ways of practicing, and I think this is one of them. It's not just a frustrating part, as I.
Yeah, I mean, obviously architecture proceeds via different media, but what would you call somebody like Lebbeus Woods, who is easily, my old friend and the greatest architect I've ever met, despite not building. So we can proceed to describe the territory of the architectural universe via different media, but somehow I think grappling with the visual as a practice is very critical in the formation of architects. And I dare say, much as I've always been skeptical of journalism schools, I don't really understand how you go to school in order to learn how to write. The worst thing that can happen as a design teacher is if your students produce work that looks like yours, and somehow teaching writing in such a way that it is unencumbered and free, I think is a very difficult proposition.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I think we're architects who didn't have the attention span to continue with it, or the patience. And just having worked briefly in OMA as a lowly intern, I think Rem is a very interesting model as a journalist who has never designed and still refuses to design. He's a kind of choreographer who, through some magic power, has surrounded himself with very good designers and then acts as an in-house critic. And I suppose that's the ultimate model somehow of combining criticism and practice. I mean, I would say the work has gone downhill dramatically, but it's a nice idea that you can be a journalist who's also principal of an enormous office building all over the world. Just like Michael.
And I think Michael's anecdote about China is the best answer to the audience question, probably. But for me, I think there are great critics who've come from both sides of that equation. I studied architectural history and theory. I was never tempted to do studio because I knew that my talent, such as it was on the writing side. So I was never tempted in that direction. Some of the greatest critics have had limited, and maybe Ollie's an example, but not too much exposure to the world of practice. And Esther McCoy in LA, who worked in Arm Schindler's office as a draftsperson during the war, and then went on to kind of invent architecture criticism in Southern California is a great example. But I also think it's worth saying that criticism itself is a profession, and it's not done well. It's not an apology or an excuse to avoid architectural practice or any other kind of practice for that matter.
Another question? Yep.
Michael, you just said that the worst thing that can happen is when students do the same work as their teacher in a way. I'm wondering, how do you all approach the actual criticism in terms of what do you judge? Do you judge the intentions? Do you judge the result? Do you judge the outcome according to the intentions? or do you judge it according to what you think architecture should be like, or urban design or landscape?
Well, as I said in my opening statement, I'm particularly interested in effects. The question of intentions is somewhat vexed as a critical category, although I think we're a little more accepting. There are intentions and intentions. Culture produces intentions, and I think it's very interesting to unpack cultural intentions rather than personal or artistic intentions. I don't as an act of judgment, since brought up on the intentional fallacy, measure a building against the author's intentions. I'm along with the kind of postmodern criticism to the degree that I think that once it's out there, it's sui generis and that you judge it. But as I say, I opened by saying that I am fascinated as a critic with architecture as producing social effects, and architecture as a measure of a whole series of social relations, social and political relations. It seems one of the most remarkably legible forms of practice in terms of its incorporation of what's going on in culture. So these are questions that burn for me. And of course, I've taught urban design for forever, and I was so desperate to teach a building that I taught a building at SciArc last term, and I also long, in a way, it's a bit of a luxury, when society's going to hell in a handbasket, to write about the fine points of turning a corner. Still, this is so central to architecture that I think we also serve our public by celebrating brilliant tectonic expression. So, I mean, if you drop that, I mean, it's the Kimmelman crisis, right? It's that he's persuaded that he wants to be a socially minded critic. He's coming to architecture from a position of relative. He's a relative neophyte, but everybody is dismayed, including every architect in New York, by the fact that there is this notion that in order to address the social register, you have to delete the formal. They are reciprocal. They support one another. And to the degree that you have the capacity to read formal expression with some subtlety, you find all sorts of interesting things embedded. I think that the history of criticism, particularly academic criticism, and that's one of the reasons I think a lot of us like to write about the city, is that we have been persuaded that the social devolves on a smaller and smaller territory. Mm-hmm. That the closet is a sufficient exemplar of social relations writ large. I don't think it is. I think there's a point of diminishing returns when you cannot simply psychoanalyze the doorknob and come up with a theory of the nation state. Nevertheless, the doorknob is critical, and certainly when one teaches, I think. I accused Michael of a kind of deductive style, of deductive descriptor of the task of academic theorizing. And I think one of the tasks both of criticism and of teaching is to somehow balance both deductive and inductive approaches, so that one can, a big idea doesn't annihilate a small one, nor vice versa. So that any moment of insight or inspiration, this is a good point of departure. Where you go is a little more problematic. But if I'm perfectly happy to do a large urban project and have somebody have an insight about a street lamp or a door jamb, if they can get going. And I think the same is very much true of criticism. You have to be sensible about where you arrive, but the point of departure, that's one of the interesting things about writing and designing is you just get started.
I think it's a really crucial question that you've asked, and I disagree slightly to the extent that I think the first task of any piece of criticism is to understand the piece that you're writing about on its own terms, and that includes intention. And then you can begin to make some judgments about it. And then you can use it to illustrate a larger point or as a vehicle to explore other issues. But I think before you do that, you have to understand and explain the piece on its own terms. That has to be step one, and I think that's true for film criticism, or as equally as it's true for architecture criticism.
Yeah, but the residence of intention isn't necessarily the author exclusively.
Of course, and probably and that's nowhere more true than in architecture, where the compromises begin at the beginning and extend all the way past the opening of the building, as I've just seen in the case of One World Trade. So, but to me, those complications and how difficult it can be to tease them out is what makes architecture criticism so much more interesting than writing about those forms where there is a little bit more pure path from intention to product.
I think it's a really important question, and it reminds me of did a similar event to this a couple of weeks ago with Owen Hatherley, who's another Guardian writer, and he told the audience, never speak to the architect. Just go, experience the building on your own terms, because that's what the public do. The public don't have the privilege of kind of touring around and hearing all about what should have happened there, what that detail was supposed to look like, what the ambition for that material, was before it was value engineered. I said exactly the opposite and said it's our role as critics to kind of explain how things went wrong, not just subjectively go in and demolish it and kind of do a bulldog polemic, but in a way, a phrase someone else used about a piece that I did on Raphael Vignoli's walkie-talkie, said the beauty of this is that he gives them enough rope to hang themselves. So it was a kind of objective piece in the sense that it was a lot of interview with Vignoli, the planning authority, the users of the building. It wasn't a kind of rah, 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 this is the worst building London has ever seen. But the kind of implication through everything Vignoli said was, actually that might well be the case. So I think actually as a critic, it's your obligation and your duty to speak to as many people as you can that were involved in the project in order to unpick, what the final result is and why it's that way.
I think this idea of translating the building in a way of understanding needs you to go through an analysis. I like this idea of tending to objectivity but trusting your subjectivity in a way. And I don't know, I think it's a moment in which you don't have a system of belief or dogmas or canons, and that makes it much more interesting, and you really do have to see what commitments the project or the piece of urban design takes and to which things it is committed. So it might be technological commitment, social commitment, and trying to disaggregate the strata of things that are all condemned in a project and try to show them in a way that makes a good communication and understandable situation. It's part of our work too.
Could we hear from a designer who, after we hear from Bill, maybe we'll then hear from a designer who reads criticism and has some thoughts about it in a way as part of the audience. But Bill, first.
Well, I don't know if I believe some of you when you say you're not that interested in an audience or that you're writing for yourselves, because I believe that all of you care a great deal about at least the potential of having an impact on the way your cities are made. So you take examples like Jane Jacobs, who stopped projects in New York, and I want to relate to that the sort of internet culture and the Twitter culture, which seems to me very much more clubby, very much more inbred, very much more not reaching the power brokers, not reaching the politicians. And does this disturb you? And there was an example today I saw, typical of internet surfing, I saw it for about 5 seconds, but somebody has written an article about Barry Diller's creating an island on the west side of Manhattan, which apparently will be for the 1% only, and very distressed at that possibility. So don't you need the dailies to have that kind of impact?
Yes, I suppose you do, but I think there's a distinction between thinking about the audience in a general term and in general terms and what a critic's impact can be, and getting to the level of, let's say, reading the comments, which I hope all of us never do, particularly those of us who write for big newspapers. I think in part this has to do with critics filling a role that, frankly, architectural education should be filling and is failing to do so. I think Harvard, GSD might be slightly an exception. I'm not just saying that because of the audience, but let me just talk about...
we have your ticket home.
Let me just talk about the schools in LA, which I know better, and I've taught at SCIARC. There's an incredible... I think the schools, and many schools around the country, but I would say most of the schools in LA, are doing a great disservice to their students by not preparing them to think about the full range of ways in which architecture operates in the world. So these schools are producing incredibly naive students who have no sense of how clients think or how politics works. And they seem to be proud of that kind of insularity. And we could have a much longer conversation about why that is and what that was a response to. I know it's these things don't just appear. They are reactions to older ways of doing things. But I think at least in LA, if you look at USC, UCLA, and SCIARC, and Woodbury is an interesting exception, I think, to that rule. A school that's much more diverse and has a student body that looks much more like Los Angeles. But the rest of the schools are producing students who are completely naive about a lot of these questions. And then it falls to the critics sometimes to talk about that relationship, both to readers and to the profession itself, it seems to me.
Yes.
Kind of build off the previous question. How do you find yourself, especially in the context of, let's say, Twitter, finding a balance or negotiating the need to speak locally and specifically and also globally? So going between speaking about kind of your respective cities, LA, New York, 19th century Rome, 17th century Rome. How does that negotiation occur?
I think you do it all. I mean, you're saying how do you decide what you tweet about? I think it's the same in terms of what you write about. You have to assume your audience is anyone, anywhere in the world, any age group. Some people will be interested, some people will delete it straight away. I think it's, you have to cover all bases. I think that's the beauty of Twitter. It's this complete rag bag of everything. And you can ignore it or you can follow up the links. I mean, I found it very useful being here. Someone spotted I was in Boston. They said, "Oh, let me take you on a tour of little-known brutalist buildings tomorrow morning." So I said, "Yes, please," and discovered the Marcel Breuer Madison Park School, which I didn't even know existed. So it's a way of finding people that you just wouldn't otherwise have any way of getting in touch with.
Hi. I'm going to offer like an expanded version of that. All of you talked about, maybe to a lesser extent, Michael, the shift toward the digital, the change in territory. So if we think about papers like The Guardian, The Village Voice, LA Times, New York Times, traditionally they were local or regional type papers. And now we shift toward this global, international internet audience, if you will. I guess, how do you address local issues like you would writing for The Village Voice when you talked about New York often, or LA Times in this, but still be able to capture a global audience? Is that clear?
And I think the opposite is true, too. I mean, I think travel and writing about projects in other cities really informs what we all write about our local cities. And that negotiation has to go both ways. It is a much more dispersed audience, and you can't make the same assumptions about the audience that you made before. And I think that's connected to the idea we were talking about before of critics not assuming a kind of tenure and not having the kind of job that they can assume they'll stay in for a career. That it's just, and that goes along with having maybe a less slippery, a more slippery hold on who your audience is and who's reading you from piece to piece.
Let me disagree with the premise of the question. I mean, why should one capture a global audience? I'm particularly interested in New York, and indeed, I think one of the agendas, certainly of my writing, research, and practice, is precisely a defense of the local. And disagreeing a little bit again with the premise is that this here neoliberal multinational culture is not necessarily doing us a world of good. And the interesting evolution of localism as an economic practice, as a social practice, as an artistic practice, I think is something that needs the most urgent and strident defense. So to the degree that I am attached to New York City as a local project, that's where I live critically and intellectually. And indeed, I think trying to discover germane and powerful forms of local culture and activity is vital to the project of culture and democracy. No joke. To kind of dissipate one's practice into something that is globally legible while potentially ignoring what is a real crisis in culture, no thanks.
But the extent to which these global forms begin to show up in the cities where we write about it helps quite a great deal to be familiar with them and the forms they take. So an example is when I went to Dubai 6 years ago or so and wrote about these towers, which were largely vacant and basically not even residential towers as much as vessels to hold excess liquidity, right? When those started appearing in London, and now that they're starting to appear in New York, the kind of pencil towers for the oligarchs, which again are just places to store excess capital or park it, then you begin to write about what that means locally in a different way as these forms begin to migrate. And I think we are, as Michael says, in an era where there's that negotiation between these global larger forces and a kind of defense of the local. But to the extent that you can recognize these things as they appear in your city, having been appearing elsewhere, that helps the defense of the local.
Of course, I've been to Starbucks already 3 times today. Nevertheless, identifying and rising in defense of advocates for the local, whether it's the food co-op or somebody who is opposing these capital parking sliver towers, that's our remit.
Mm-hmm. I'd agree with all of that. Just one caveat, I think there's something to be said sometimes for the outsider's perspective. And so when The Guardian launched its cities site, part of my job is going to a different city somewhere in the world every 2 months and doing a big investigation into what's going on. And it's, half of me feels like it's the Iwan Barnification of architecture, kind of dropping in helicopter style, like REM flying over Lagos, which has obviously been incredibly criticised. On the other hand, there's really something to be said for being dropped in a place that you know nothing about. So I did a piece on Cape Town, which to me, apartheid is still functioning. It was incredibly shocking to see that kind of division in just the urban planning and the kind of infrastructure. If you live there, you get used to it. And so people become incredibly desensitized. It's the same in Beirut, which was my latest kind of cities feature. A lot of the corruption that had gone on with Solidaire and the downtown redevelopment, they're used to it. It's everyday life. But as an outsider, you often just see the obvious, which as a kind of local embedded critic, you sometimes ignore. So it can be useful sometimes to be dropped into somewhere strange.
I wonder if we could end, Moshe, could I ask you if you have ever benefited from a piece of criticism, or has it changed? No, in a different way. Has a piece of criticism changed your attitude about what you've done, what you will do, positive, negative?
I've been sitting here thinking of all the various experiences I've had, actually, and one of the issues that it raises, which is interesting, is the power of the critics. Because there are moments where critics do have a position of power that has extraordinary impact. In my own experience, I think Paul Goldberg was contributed substantially to the downfall of the Scheme for Columbus Center, which you could have said maybe he was right, but when you look at what was built after, I don't think he was so right. But there is a situation where the critic actually has an influence on the outcome. And one interesting question is, how do you deal with this responsibility, with that power? Your question, do you benefit? Does it affect you? It affects you both ways. I mean, there are moments where you feel you're buoyed by it as an architect. There are moments where I'm sure that Calatrava must be, in the last 2-3 years, really feeling like Job. Although, earlier there were 3-4 years where, he could do no wrong in anything. So you sort of wonder, how could it be that he's buoyed at one point and he's dumped on at another point. And I was thinking of the recent writing about Paul Rudolph, from the crest of critical acclaim by all the critics of the day, different group, and then the critical dumping upon, just fascinating. I mean, there's more to it than meets the eye.
Mm-hmm.
And what are these forces that cause these ups and downs and approvals and disapprovals and all that goes with it? And you come down to the question of values, to the question of position, to the question of belief. To what extent is a critic, asserting one's belief and values? And sometimes you find yourself on the right side of it or the wrong side of it as a practitioner.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. I'm going to let that close us out and thank our visitors and critics and the audience. Thanks very much, all of you.